Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political commentator Al Spry. We're going back to the Korean War, Reagan, and a story about Christmas.
We'll be joined by historian Stanley Weintraub. Yes, he's been here before, and I think you'll enjoy hearing him again. So we'll invite you to pull up a chair, put an ear on the radio. A Christmas Far From Home is our story. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm Al Spry, raconteur and man about time. It's great to see you, Reagan.
Always a pleasure to be with you, sir, and of course, always a great pleasure to welcome our viewers on Tough TV 38 as well, Al.
Yes, I'd like to give a shout-out, of course, of thanks to the wonderful Will Strickler, manager and raconteur himself of Tough TV 38. He brings you this show, and so you can see our ugly mugs every week, 3 times a week.
We haven't broken a camera yet. But
I don't know. I think we have, but people are afraid to tell us because of the repercussions.
Could be.
So we want to thank him, of course, and Sue Lupia at Towers Broadcasting and all that good stuff. So thank you guys for all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now let's dive in. You said you had some funny stuff from George Will.
George Will, reflecting back on the year and some of the stories that kind of caught an eye here and there. And the federal government, they have Tomahawk cruise missiles. They have Apache helicopters. They have Lakota helicopters. And they use the code name Geronimo in the attack that killed Osama bin Laden. But this past year, they objected to the name of the Washington Redskins. Something to think about.
Yeah.
U.S. Forest Service article on safe marshmallow toasting did not neglect to nag us. It suggested fruit rather than eat chocolate in s'mores. The droll Orange County Register wondered, quote, why not replace the marshmallow with a Brussels sprout, unquote. The federal government's food police began cracking down on the school bake sales. Step away from those brownies and put your hands on a fruit cup. All right. Thank you, George.
George is pretty good.
Yeah.
So Jonathan Gruber, I think you guys have heard that name lately. He is a health economist who just can't keep his trap shut, and he makes really stupid comments. He's the one who helped construct the what is colloquially known as Obamacare. And this is an MIT economist. He worked on Obamacare and Romney Care. He's the guy who thinks voters are quote-unquote stupid. He's also the guy who thinks Obamacare was passed because of trickery. And he says voters don't understand economics. For a while, Fox News didn't run anything else except all these quotes. So that's pretty good programming for a 24-hour news cycle.
Really.
But let's hear about this. I don't know. This is what you call ultimate hubris, or this is a guy who wants to brag about how cool he is. So after everything got passed, these quotes are from 2011. Gruber spoke at the Pioneer Institute in Boston. Quote, the only way we could take it on, healthcare he's talking about, was first by mislabeling it, calling it a tax on insurance plans rather than a tax on people, when we all know it's really a tax on people who hold those insurance plans. And, of course, here's another quote from 2012. Quote, we just tax the insurance companies. They pass it on in higher prices. That offsets the tax break we get. It's a very clever, basic exploitation of the lack of economic understanding of the American voter.
Well, now there he might be onto something.
I'm not saying what he said was incorrect, but boy,
we didn't expect it. That's for sure.
we sure didn't expect him telling all the Americans are stupid. The only other person who gets away with that is a comedian named Bill Maher. He says all the Americans are stupid, but he's comics. You give him a little bit more of a pass,
a little more leeway.
Plus the fact that there are many stupid Americans. So do I get a pass? I'm a comic. I'm stepping into a comic thing right now.
We'll put you down as neutral and all of that.
Well, what do you think of all this, Reagan?
I'm not sure what to think of it. I don't know how much they paid him to change sides.
And Group is going to be appearing before Congress. That's why we're bringing it up right now to Darrell Iss's committee. And we'll see what comes from that.
There'll be another chapter written here. All right. Well, we're going to pause along the network line. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We will be joined by historian Stanley Weintraub. Yes, he has been here before. He's got a brand new book, A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. Stay put. The conversation continues in a moment. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, at this time, we're as promised, we are joined by historian Stanley Weintraub. He has a brand new book from Da Capo Press, A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. And Stanley Weintraub, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Glad to be with you. I think I've been with you before.
You have, sir. A couple of, I believe it was last Christmas was probably the last time. We talked about Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, and we visited about the election of 1944. So it's a privilege to have you back.
A year goes by really quickly. We hope you've had a good one.
It's been very productive.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Stanley, why... you had focused on World War II for several of your books, marvelous stories, The Pearl Harbor Christmas and Silent Night, but now A Christmas Far From Home, and you have shifted your focus to the Korean War. What brought this about?
Well, the Korean War was my war. I was a young officer in it. In fact, I was there for 2 Christmases during the war.
And so is this almost a personal memoir then, or what are we looking at here?
No, it's not a personal memoir because the book ends on Christmas Eve, 1950, which is just before I arrived in Korea. But I knew many of the people who were involved in it, and their memories were very striking.
Well, this Christmas Far From Home... a part of this story begins or is centered on, I don't know if we want to call it a promise, but a statement from Douglas MacArthur earlier in 1950 that all the war was going to be over and all the troops were going to be home for Christmas of 1950.
He lived in a fantasy world, one of his own making. It was all impossible. But his intelligence people told him what he wanted to hear. There was no way that troops who went into North Korea, 8,000 or more miles from home, could possibly end the war and be home by Christmas. It was just logistically impossible. It proved to be impossible from other means, too, because he had been warned that the communist Chinese who had just taken over mainland China would not want our forces on their border and would intervene. But he said that he didn't believe it. They wouldn't intervene.
I mean, did you think that this was a man, obviously this is a great general of World War II, also served in World War I, a well-known name at the time. He had, but previous to this, he was basically de facto ruler of Japan when they reformed after the war. What do you think? Do you think it was just he was just at the end of his wits? I mean, was he just starting to slip a little bit, or why do you think he would put himself in such a fantasy state?
Of course, he was slipping a bit. He was then 70. He was not only the oldest general in the Army, but he was the most senior general in the Army, the only five-star general left after World War II. His fantasy world, though, was a result of his being, as you pointed out, the shogun of Japan, the de facto ruler. I visited his office in Tokyo later on, and it was an interesting sight because it gave you an idea as to how he behaved. The Daiichi building, which means number one insurance building across from the Emperor's Palace, was taken over by him for his headquarters. He had the top floor, and his office overlooked the Emperor's Palace. So from where he sat, he could actually pretend he was the emperor.
And he was higher up than the emperor in altitude. He was higher up. So you think that, as the old saying goes, power corrupts, and maybe there was a little bit of power corruption there, and he kind of...
There certainly was, but unspoken in his case was the fact that early in 1952, which was then a little more than a year away, would be the presidential primaries. And he was interested in becoming president. He had been for years. He wanted to become president in the 1930s when he was chief of staff of the Army, and tried to get an appointment as a vice presidential candidate. It didn't succeed. He tried to run for president during World War II in 1944, and he only got a couple of votes in the Republican convention. After the war, Dwight Eisenhower visited him in Tokyo. Eisenhower had become chief of staff of the Army, and the two of them chatted about politics in MacArthur's office, and each one said to the other, "You're going to be the next president of the United States," and each one denied it. But both had ambitions to be president.
But one was right. Of course, Ike became president, and that could have been MacArthur, right? So it wasn't unrealistic.
It could have been MacArthur if he had actually won the war that he had gone out to fight and unified Korea by occupying North Korea. But that was not in the cards to do. All that he tried to do was wrong in North Korea. Going there was wrong in the first place, and the Pentagon told him that this was a mistake. If he got too close to the Chinese border, they would intervene. And of course he said no. He had landed troops north of Seoul in September 1950 at Incheon, which was a great success when he had surrounded the North Korean army, which had penetrated into the south. And we had about 100,000 prisoners that we had to somehow find a place for, and it became impossible. The only way we could do it was to build barbed wire fences around where they sat in paddy fields so that we could hold them. But that wasn't enough. He thought that the North Korean army was finished and he could move easily up and take it over. But the means he used was utterly wrong. Instead of moving north on the west coast of Korea where he had been, he ordered half of the troops there to go back onto their ships and be reloaded with their ammunition and supplies and sail all the way around the south coast of Korea and up north again and land on the east coast. The idea was a pincers movement to surround the communist troops. Well, it took over a month to get this done, and by the time he got the troops to Wonsan on the east coast, the North Koreans and the Chinese knew very well about it. They had mined the harbors. Bob Hope had come to entertain the troops, and there were no troops there. They were offshore, stuck because of the minefields. But
wow, I never knew that story. That's interesting.
He had to fly out to an aircraft carrier on a helicopter and entertain troops on the carrier. He wrote about it later.
You know, I was going to say it's very interesting, and I wanted to make this point. What do you think 60 years later that we're still in a technical war with North Korea? Did you think that would be the case since you were involved in the war?
No, I didn't think that would be the case because I thought that they would be so disarmed and in need of assistance that they would look for a way to not have to put all the resources into an army. But the fanaticism was unbelievable. We had troops in prison camps in South Korea, there's communist troops, who were amputees. I think one compound had 2,300 amputees. They rioted. They marched on their stumps, waving homemade flags. Their fanaticism was just unbelievable, and we didn't expect that. But we also didn't expect that the Chinese would come down in such force. It was, after all, winter coming, and I begin the book basically on Thanksgiving Day, when the troops were celebrating Thanksgiving by having flown in Thanksgiving dinners from Japan. It had gotten so cold, they called the wind the Siberian Express, that food froze before it got to their mouths, and they called them turkey popsicles. That sounded funny, but it indicated how bad things were. The next day, MacArthur flew in to Korea and announced to the troops that their offensive was going to begin the next day, and they were going to go all the way to the Yalu River border with China, and the war would be over by Christmas, and they would go home. Of course, that never happened. You don't, as a commanding general, announce when your offensive is beginning and where you're going, but he did. He then went back to Japan. He only spent a couple of hours in Korea. He then flew back to Japan along the Yalu River at first, so he said he could see what was going on. Well, from 9,000 or 10,000 feet, his plane saw nothing but snow. You couldn't see a person. There was no way to know that the Chinese were infiltrating. And when he got back to Japan for dinner, he radioed Washington that he had made a reconnaissance of the Yalu River front, and there wasn't a single Chinese person to be seen, which was nonsense. But
well, and of course
tens of thousands of Chinese that had already crossed.
Maybe he needed glasses.
Well, they helped too by turning their jackets with the white side out and blending in with the snow, so in the daylight they couldn't be seen.
They did that, of course, at ground level. MacArthur couldn't have seen them even if they wore bright red uniforms.
Yeah.
Wow.
So this was just a part of the fantasy that he lived in. But he never spent a single night in Korea during the entire war.
Wow. Stan, on that note, we do need to take a pause along our network line. I want to come back to that thought and ask you about that. But we do have to remind the folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is historian Stanley Weintraub. His brand new book, A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. It's from our friends at DeCapo Press. We assume that it's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. It is an extraordinary read, one that we highly recommend. And if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, historian Stanley Weintraub. We are talking about his brand new book, A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. It's from our friends at DeCapo Press, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com. And Of course, we know we have a very large segment of Korean War veterans who have retired and are residing here in Florida, and we trust that many of them are with us, Stan, this weekend. But as we came to the end of that preceding segment there, we were talking about General MacArthur and how he never actually even spent a single night in Korea, the war that he was supposed to be commanding, or he was commanding. But what I wanted to ask you is a lot of folks said that MacArthur was a very haughty man, and there he was in his tower in Tokyo, running the war by remote control, if you will. I mean, he's a long ways away.
Yes, he was 700 miles away.
Yeah.
In Tokyo, living in the former American embassy, living a very posh life, and having nothing but ambitions to be president. Of course, something he didn't say to anybody, but that's what was back in his mind. But that required a victory. And one of his most famous lines is, "There is no substitute for victory." And of course there is. We fought a number of limited wars since then, and that word limited war has replaced in many ways the term victory. MacArthur, on the east coast of Korea, had the 1st Marine Division, which was the most professional army in Korea. But he also had army troops there, and put in as commander his very loyal deputy, Edward Almond, to command all of them. Edward Almond knew nothing about Korea either. He flew into Korea with a transport plane that had on it trailers with house trailers with equipment for his own posh living. He had a shower, he had a kitchen, he had a bar that was well stocked, and frozen steaks and so on. He lived a very good life while the others lived on sea rations, and he flew up and down to see the troops, giving out medals. The medals meant nothing. The troops threw some of the medals in the snow because they had such contempt for him.
I have
and for MacArthur. MacArthur, in fact, I had mentioned earlier, MacArthur had flown over North Korea briefly and then came back to Tokyo. When he got to Tokyo at Haneda Air Base, General Stratemeyer, the Air Force chief, awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross, I guess because he didn't have one.
Would you say that, so was this a vanity war?
On his part, it was, yes.
I mean, because you could say maybe later on, maybe Vietnam was a vanity war on Johnson's part, or to that effect, and McNamara. But there are some parallels, obviously, not only with the area of the war, but I think with the reasons for going to war. The interesting quote that opens your book: "The second law of thermodynamics dictates that every physical system tends towards maximum disorder." Why did you include this quote?
Everything falls apart, is what it really means. And his strategy fell apart very quickly. Even though tens of thousands of the enemy, sneaker-clad Chinese who weren't prepared for this weather, died in the swirling snow of hunger, exposure, and our own firepower, there were plenty of dead on our side, and the Chinese, who had just contempt for human life, quickly infiltrated in and surrounded our troops. There was no way that they could get to the Yalu River and stay there. They had to retreat. They were running out of ammunition. At one point, a Marine unit radioed to Japan, saying, "We've run out of 16-millimeter mortar shells. Can you airdrop some ammunition to us?" But they had to do that by code because the Chinese obviously listened into our radio, and they radioed for Tootsie Rolls. And guess what they got? They got tens of thousands of Tootsie Rolls.
Of real Tootsie Rolls.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Didn't do them much good.
You know, I just think was it coming out of World War II. We just thought, hey, this will be a piece of cake. Was there was an over exuberance or to that?
I think that hits the nail on the head. MacArthur was running an occupation army in Tokyo that was as soft as you could imagine. The Eighth Army. I was part of that Eighth Army when it went to Korea. The troops did not do KP. They didn't make their beds. They had nothing much to do except enjoy life because the hired Japanese did it all for them. But that didn't work when they got to Korea. They had to be professionals, and they didn't have much training. Their equipment was often World War II equipment. And the result was that our own dead, when possible, were piled up for retrieval like cordwood on trucks and jeeps and tanks, along with the frozen wounded, many of whom were saved by the below zero cold because it congealed their oozing blood.
Wow.
That's an ironic thing to happen, but it was a terrible situation. And the key problem that they came to was that they earlier, to get north, they had crossed the narrow concrete bridge that went over a chasm that concealed a power plant. The Chinese blew it. In order for the troops to have a fighting withdrawal, they had to cross that chasm. It was 4,000 feet up, and the weather was 20 to 30 below zero. What did they do? They radioed for, I guess we'd have to call them bridge sections. They called them treadways. And the Marine General Oliver Smith, who was a brilliant commander, but disliked by MacArthur, and the dislike was mutual, had his troops cross this narrow one-lane bridge they had built over the Fuchilum Pass. Thousands of feet below was the surging water that was then beginning to freeze. They had to cross, once they built it, under fire at 2 miles an hour because of the danger of the crossing. The treads and tires even overlapped on both sides.
Oh, wow. At 4,000 feet up. Wow.
That's scary.
It was a tremendous sight, I'm sure, to see. And on foot, the men looked like a walking arsenal, according to a reporter who was with them. They had grenades strung across their chests and around their waists and around the sleeves of their snow-whitened parkas. And someone in the column, because it was getting toward Christmas, remarked that they looked like a walking army of Christmas trees. Yeah. But one truck actually slipped off the slippery surface, and dead and wounded Marines tumbled out of it end over end.
Wow.
The truck hit bottom on its rear end with its headlights streaming up the canyon wall. It was a terrible sight, and it was a terrible experience for them to have to fight their way back to the sea. But I guess it's not giving anything away to say that they did find their way back to the sea. There were 93 ships that were waiting for them, and they didn't get home by Christmas, but by 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, the ships pulled away from North Korea.
Absolutely incredible, Stan. A word or two more about this intense cold, because I think maybe today's listeners don't appreciate. You know, Al grew up and spent time in upstate New York, and I spent time in Cleveland, and we'd get 14, 15 below zero, you know. But you're talking 20 and 30 below zero and horrible winds. I mean, just incredibly cold.
It was incredibly cold, and troops couldn't even dig foxholes because of the cold. They had to use explosives to dig holes that they could conceal themselves in, and they would stand up in their sleeping bags in the foxholes. And on one occasion, the sergeant brought his lieutenant over to see a Chinese who they found in one of the foxholes, and the the lieutenant said, "He must be dead," and the sergeant said, "No, his eyes are moving."
Wow.
The only thing left of that.
Yeah. We have to pause again along the network line here. We'll remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our special guest, Stanley Weintraub, and we'll continue our conversation in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is historian Stanley Weintraub. His brand new book from Da Capo Press, A Christmas Far From Home, the epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. And Stan, if I might, I wanted to slip in here a comment. Story that I've heard over the years, no love between MacArthur and Eisenhower. And, of course, in 1950, and at the time of this story, Eisenhower is out of the Army. And MacArthur pretty much has it to himself. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are afraid of him.
Yeah,
But
Eisenhower had been a secretary and speechwriter for MacArthur.
Yeah.
When MacArthur was chief of staff in Washington, and he found him valuable, and he brought him to the Philippines.
Yeah.
But it was hard for Eisenhower to get promoted. He itched under the regime of MacArthur, and finally he was able to leave and go home and make a career for himself.
Yeah.
They didn't like each other, and MacArthur would say about Eisenhower when the two of them became equals as five-star generals, he was the best secretary I ever had.
Yes.
And Eisenhower's response was, I learned dramatics under MacArthur.
That's exactly the quote that I was looking at, Stan. Well, so here we are. The Chinese have jumped in with both feet. MacArthur has made this horrible error. The troops have to be extricated, and MacArthur has got to face the music. Talk about that.
MacArthur had to face the music, but he didn't expect that he would really have to accept on his own terms. As he was a political icon to the far right in the America he hadn't visited since 1937, he was hard to fire. Congress would have been upset about it. Truman delayed the uncomfortable inevitable until April 1951. That he finally fired him for insubordination. MacArthur flew home about a week later on his personal plane. The plane had been labeled on the nose SCAP for his Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, but he was no longer that, and he had the plane relabeled Bataan. Bataan was the peninsula that in the Philippines on the island of Luzon, in which there was such great heroism on the part of American troops in early 1942. And MacArthur identified with it, although he had no business doing so. He spent exactly 2 hours on Bataan in his entire life, but he was the hero of Bataan, self-described. And at that point, every communique that he issued would refer to MacArthur's men and never to any single person but MacArthur. So he lived in a world of his own making. And when he came home, he made a speech to Congress the next day, literally, in Washington, and uttered that famous line from the song about old soldiers never die, they just fade away, and that he was just going to fade away. He had no intentions of fading away. He was preparing himself to appear before the Republican National Convention when the presidential choice would be made. He made a very poor showing there. He was getting old and tired and couldn't even remember his lines, and he really did fade away.
And he came back to a hero's welcome at Ticker Tape Parade in New York.
That was before people understood what had gone on, because MacArthur had invented his own reality, and almost all the news that came from the Far East came from MacArthur's office, which he had prepared and often even wrote himself. People were awed by him. His speaking voice was tremendously effective, and an awed representative from Missouri, I think his name was Dewey Short, announced after his speech in Congress, "We heard God speak here today, God in the flesh,
Wow.
the voice of God." That was how he was thought of until people learned the facts about how things got screwed up.
Yeah. Stan, we're going to have to call a halt to the proceedings here, but I want to remind the folks that the book is A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. Da Capo Press is the publisher. Stanley Weintraub, the author. A Christmas not so pleasant to remember in Korea, that of 1950. But and Al and Stan, I think that with all of the Korean War veterans that live in Florida, we could well dedicate this program and your book to the service and to the families of those who served in the Korean War, who are now here with us here in Florida and of course, all across the country. It's 5 stars, Stan. We hope people will pick it up and give it a good read. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And Stanley Weintraub, thank you so much for your time. Al and I will be back with a closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry, and it's, of course, great to be here, Reagan, on Tough TV 3 times a week.
Absolutely.
On Wednesdays at 9 a.m., Saturdays at 9 a.m., Sundays at 9 a.m. on Tough TV 38, which you can get over the air with an HD antenna. And it comes in crystal clear right here.
Yeah.
Also, you can petition your cable company that you want it, because it's really cool programming. And it's kind of like Spike TV, but it has us, so it's by default it's better.
Little icing on the cake there.
And I'm sounding a little like MacArthur. Yes. I'm having a MacArthur fantasy.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at Florida politics before we go. The winner of the week is Satan.
Really?
Yes, the Florida Department of Management Services last week approved a holiday display from the Satanic Temple of Tallahassee in the rotunda of our Florida Capitol after the temple threatened to sue if its request was ejected again. And if you saw this thing, it's really pathetic. It's a diorama with some plastic, a paper angel kind of falling into hell or something like that. And I don't think they thought they would win, so they didn't really have anything constructed. The loser of the week is Major Harding, the retired Florida Supreme Court Justice, has been picked for a no-win job, guaranteed to infuriate a lot of people, issue a student conduct hearing ruling on the sexual assault allegations against Florida State's Jameis Winston.
Okay.
And a bonus D.C. edition winners. Representative Ted Yoho, Republican of Gainesville. The House passed on a mostly party line vote his bill expressing disapproval of President Obama's executive order on immigration. It'll die in the Senate, but Yoho, for a brief time, was in the national spotlight.
Okay.
And Representative Ander Crenshaw, Republican of Jacksonville, the House overwhelmingly passed his Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, or ABLE Act, which allows people with disabilities to set up savings accounts. He'd been working on the bill for quite a few years.
You know, that doesn't seem like it would be that tough to do, but apparently if it took several years to get it through, that almost seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it?
I would think so.
But
also, Governor Scott appoints Mike Carroll as permanent DCF secretary. We had Mr. Carroll on.
Yeah, when he took the job.
When he first took the job.
As interim director, yeah.
I mean, that just must mean that he's doing a pretty good job so far. So I'm going to take a wait-and-see attitude on that, Reagan.
Well, let's wish him well. I mean, anybody who goes into DCF as the director needs all the help they can get.
No kidding.
All the support and good wishes.
Well, you have to break some eggs to get things done over there, it seems. So
it's not certainly not an easy position, and I would say it's a rather thankless position.
I think
sure.
so. Yeah, absolutely. And briefly, well, this is kind of interesting. A judge allows allegations that Governor Scott intentionally violated records laws. There's an opening of a door for a new complaint against the governor that he intentionally withheld public records in violation of state law. The quote is, "It's a violation of the public record laws to wait 18 months to produce records, and then 2 years after we request them, suddenly produce emails."
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, Al, we're going to have to run up the white flag here. We'll call this a show for this particular week. We want to say thank you for the pleasure of your company. We know you have lots of choices out there, and we do appreciate your spending a few minutes with us. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Next week on the Florida Roundtable, a representative of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and that should be interesting conversation. So we'll see you next week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.